My name is Kennel, and back in 2021, I was 17 years old, living with my parents in a peaceful suburban neighborhood. It was one of those places where life felt uneventful, with tidy streets lined by nearly identical houses. People would wave politely but rarely stop to chat. But that night, everything ordinary unraveled into a scene straight out of a thriller. It was a rainy Saturday evening, and my parents had gone to a neighbor's house a few streets away for their usual chess night. They loved their games, but I found it boring to sit through endless discussions about pawns and strategies. I told them I'd stay home, planning a cozy night to myself, snacks and a horror movie. No one gets out alive. By 9:30 p.m., I was settled on the couch, the lights dimmed low, and the rain tapping against the windows creating the perfect eerie ambience. I was halfway through the movie when I heard a strange noise outside. At first, I brushed it off as just the storm, but it persisted. "You're imagining things, Kennel," I told myself, trying to shake off the unease. Then, at precisely 10 p.m., a loud bang echoed through the house. This wasn't thunder, it was coming from the front door. My heart raced as I froze. Who would be knocking this late, in such weather? Cautiously, I crept toward the door, careful not to make any noise, and peeked through the peephole. A woman stood on my porch. She looked around 30, her rain-soaked jacket clinging to her, her drenched hair plastered to her face. She seemed pale and desperate. "Please," she called out, her voice barely audible over the rain. "I need help. My car broke down, and my phone is dead. Can I use yours to call someone?" I hesitated, my pulse quickening. Under the glow of the streetlight, I could see her car parked by the curb. Its engine was still running. That struck me as odd. Why would her car be running if it was broken? Squinting through the peephole, I tried to make sense of the situation. Against my better judgment, I unlatched the door and opened it a crack. She stood there, shivering. "Thank you," she said, stepping closer. But as I moved slightly aside, I saw him, a man in a black hoodie sprinting toward the house. His face was partially obscured, and in his hand, he held a gun. Panic surged through me. I slammed the door shut before the woman could step inside, twisting the deadbolt and locking the chain. She screamed and pounded on the door. "Let me in." "You don't understand," she shouted. The man reached the porch, banging his fist against the door. "Open up," he yelled, his voice a terrifying mix of anger and desperation. My heart pounded as I stumbled back, unsure of what to do. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of glass shattering from the back of the house. My breath caught as I rushed toward the kitchen. There he was, trying to climb through the broken window. Without thinking, I grabbed a frying pan and swung it at him. He dodged, but his hand caught on the jagged glass, leaving streaks of blood on the frame. Swearing, he retreated into the shadows. I dashed back to the living room, shaking as I grabbed my phone and called 911. My voice trembled as I explained the situation to the operator, who assured me officers were on their way and told me to stay on the line. The banging on the front door grew more frantic, and the woman's pleas turned desperate. "You don't understand. Please, let us in," she cried. I ignored her and bolted to the bathroom, locking myself inside. Clutching my phone like a lifeline, I texted my parents, warning them to stay away. My dad replied almost instantly, saying he'd called the neighbors for help, too. Minutes felt like hours. The operator stayed on the line, trying to keep me calm. Then, suddenly, everything went silent. No banging, no shouting, just an eerie stillness. That's when I heard it. Footsteps upstairs. My stomach dropped as I realized I hadn't even thought about the attic window. Had they climbed onto the roof? The footsteps grew louder, moving toward the staircase. Finally, the sound of sirens pierced the air, and flashing red and blue lights illuminated the bathroom window. I stayed frozen, praying the police would arrive before the intruders found me. A loud knock on the bathroom door made me jump. "Police," a voice called. I hesitated, unsure if it was a trick. But then I heard voices downstairs, real, authoritative voices. Summoning all my courage, I unlocked the door and peeked out. Officers were sweeping through the house, their flashlights scanning every corner. "It's clear," one of them said, though his tone didn't reassure me. The attic window had been left open, but the intruders were gone. The police took my statement while other officers combed the neighborhood. My parents arrived minutes later, their faces pale with worry. My dad hugged me tightly. "We're not leaving you alone again," he promised. The woman's car was found abandoned a few streets away. It had been stolen. Inside, the police discovered duct tape, zip ties, and a knife. The blood on the window matched a suspect linked to other home invasions in the area. I didn't sleep at all that night, replaying the events in my mind. What if I'd let them in? The thought made my stomach turn. The woman and her accomplice were never caught, and that lingering question, what might have happened, haunts me to this day. This story took place on Christmas Day in 2017, back when I was still a teenager. My family was hosting a big holiday gathering, and relatives from all over, first, second, and even third cousins, were coming to celebrate. I was thrilled since it had been 3 years since I'd seen many of them. It felt like the perfect chance to catch up. The first guests started arriving around 11:30 a.m., and by 1 p.m., the house was bustling with chatter, laughter, and the clatter of dishes being placed on the dining table. Everyone brought something to share, and the festive spirit was in full swing. Among the guests was my dad's cousin, Lester. He brought a fruit salad and a cheerful attitude, but something about him immediately felt off to me. I'd never met him before since he lived in California, far from our East Coast home, so I figured I was just not used to his personality. Still, there was something about him that made me uneasy. Lunch was served around 2:30 p.m., and we all sat down to enjoy the food and exchange stories about what we'd been up to. The house was filled with energy, and it was heartwarming to see everyone reconnecting after so long. Once we finished eating, everyone pitched in to clear the table and tidy up. While I was helping in the kitchen, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a call from my best friend, Elsa. I stepped into my room for privacy since I didn't want anyone overhearing our chat. We talked about our Christmas plans and the gifts we'd received. After about 15 minutes, I hung up, stretched, and was about to rejoin the party when there was a knock at my door. It was Lester. I was surprised. Why would he want to talk to me? Still, I invited him in. He stepped inside, glancing around the room as if he were curious about it. "Hey there," he said casually. "How's school going?" I told him it was fine and that I was enjoying my first year of high school. He asked a few more questions about my favorite subjects and teachers, which seemed normal enough. Then, out of nowhere, he asked something odd. "Have you ever noticed anything strange about this house?" I stared at him, confused. Strange? Like what? He tilted his head and gave a faint smile that made me uncomfortable. "Oh, I don't know," he replied. "Sometimes old houses have their secrets." Not knowing what to say, I shrugged and told him I hadn't noticed anything unusual. He nodded, muttered something under his breath, and left the room. Despite his departure, the uneasy feeling he left behind lingered. Later that evening, as the party moved into the living room for gift opening, I noticed Lester sitting off to the side, staring out the window. He seemed lost in thought, almost anxious. When I asked if he was okay, he smiled faintly and said, "Oh, I'm fine, just enjoying the view." But the view was nothing special. It was pitch dark outside, with only the faint outlines of trees visible in the backyard. As the night progressed, Lester's behavior grew even stranger. He wandered through the house, stopping to stare at random objects like family photos or the antique clock in the hallway. At one point, I saw him standing by the basement door, staring at it intently. "Everything okay?" I asked hesitantly. He jumped slightly, then turned and gave a quick, dismissive smile. "Oh, nothing. Just curious," he said before walking away. The basement wasn't anything interesting, just an old, unfinished space full of dusty boxes and storage shelves. I couldn't understand what would make him curious about it. By 9 p.m., most of the guests had started leaving. After many hugs and thank yous, the house began to quiet down. Only my immediate family and Lester remained. My parents, worried about the late hour, invited him to stay the night rather than drive to his hotel. I wasn't thrilled about the idea, but I kept my thoughts to myself. Later that night, as I lay in bed scrolling through my phone, I heard the creak of footsteps downstairs. I assumed it was my dad checking the locks or maybe Lester grabbing a snack. Then I heard the basement door open, followed by the faint sound of footsteps going down the stairs. Curiosity got the better of me. I tiptoed out of my room and down the hallway, stopping at the top of the basement stairs. The light was on. Peeking down, I saw Lester standing in the middle of the basement, holding a flashlight and examining something on the floor. "Lester?" I called out, my voice shaky. He jumped, quickly turning off the flashlight. "Oh, hi," he said, trying to sound nonchalant. "I couldn't sleep, so I thought I'd check out the basement. You know, basements are fascinating." Fascinating? That was the last word I'd use to describe our dusty, cluttered storage space. I didn't know how to respond, so I just watched as he nervously smiled and brushed past me, heading upstairs without another word. The next morning, Lester was gone. My parents said he'd left early to catch his flight, but something about it didn't sit right with me. Feeling uneasy, I decided to check the basement. That's when I noticed it. One of the floorboards near the back wall had been pried loose. Inside the gap was a small, dusty box. I pulled it out and opened it, finding old letters and photographs from the 1940s. They belonged to the previous owners of the house. There was nothing particularly strange about the items, just faded memories from a bygone era. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Lester had been looking for something specific. When I showed my parents the box, they were as confused as I was. To this day, I have no idea why Lester was so interested in the basement or why he acted so strangely. That Christmas remains unforgettable, not because of the gifts or family gathering, but because of the unsettling mystery surrounding Lester and the secrets he seemed determined to uncover. Back in 2019, I began my freshman year at Queens College in New York City. Now, as a senior, I reflect on those times with a mix of emotions. When I first arrived, I felt a combination of nerves and excitement about starting my film studies. Since I was from Chicago, I mostly stayed on campus throughout the school year and only returned home for breaks. Orientation day was particularly intense. I worried about fitting in and making friends. By the end of that day, though, I had connected with several fellow film students. Yet, one person stood out, and not in a good way, Dylan. Dylan had an unusual energy about him. He constantly talked about obscure movies and made random jokes that never quite landed. Initially, I assumed he was just a bit socially awkward, but something felt off about him. As weeks went by, his behavior became more troubling. He would barge into conversations uninvited, often speaking loudly about strange topics that no one could relate to. Our small friend group tolerated him because he was persistent, but we weren't exactly happy to have him around. Then, during a dinner one evening, my friend Mary Kate shared a piece of unsettling news. "Have you heard about Dylan?" she asked. "A couple of girls said he's been following them back to their dorms. They're scared." Hearing this made my stomach drop. I wasn't entirely surprised, but having it confirmed was alarming. From that point on, I avoided Dylan as much as possible, keeping my distance. Still, he had a knack for finding our group and joining conversations as if nothing was wrong. One afternoon, he sat with us at lunch without invitation. His usual rambling took a darker turn when he asked, "Why does everyone look at me like I'm some kind of freak? What's their problem?" He wouldn't let the topic go, and finally, I lost patience. "Maybe it's because you don't respect people's boundaries, Dylan. Not everything is about you." His expression twisted with anger, but he didn't reply. He simply stood up and left in a huff. I hoped that would be the end of it, but things only got worse. Thanksgiving break arrived, and I flew back to Chicago to be with my family. My parents were delighted to have me home, and I spent much of my time resting and catching up. One evening, around 9:30 p.m., I was in my room scrolling through my phone when I heard a knock on my window. Being on the ground floor, I initially thought it might be a prank. But when I pulled the curtain back, my heart stopped. It was Dylan, standing there under the dim glow of the streetlight. Panic surged through me. How did he find me? Why was he here? I dropped the curtain and rushed out of my room to tell my parents. "Mom, Dad, Dylan's outside my window." I blurted out. "Who?" my dad asked, confused. "A guy from school. He's been acting weird, and now he's here." My mom immediately stood up. "Let's check," she said. We all went back to my room, and she peered out the window. "There's no one there," she said calmly, though doubt laced her voice. "He was just there," I insisted, shaken. "Maybe you're stressed," my dad said. "Get some rest." I didn't argue, but I knew what I'd seen. Sleep was out of the question that night as my mind raced with fear and questions. The days that followed were tense. Every time I passed a window or stepped outside, I felt like someone was watching me. I tried to rationalize it, wondering if maybe I had been mistaken. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Back at school, Dylan had seemingly disappeared. Rumors circulated that he'd been expelled for harassing other students. Although I was relieved not to see him around campus, I couldn't shake the lingering sense of unease. One night, I stayed late in the library working on a project. Walking back to my dorm, I felt a presence behind me. Glancing over my shoulder, I saw a shadowy figure in the distance. I couldn't make out who it was, but instinct told me to hurry. I quickened my pace and reached the safety of my dorm, heart pounding. Over the next few weeks, odd things began happening. A notebook I was sure I had left in my room turned up in my backpack. My dorm key went missing for a day and then mysteriously reappeared on my desk. There was no solid proof, but I knew Dylan was involved. One evening, I came back to my dorm after class to find a note taped to my door. The writing was shaky, almost illegible, but I recognized the signature, Dylan. It read, "You don't get to ignore me. We're not finished." Fear turned to determination. I took the note to campus security and explained everything, from the incident at my house to the harassment on campus. They assured me they'd investigate and told me to stay vigilant. That night, I heard footsteps outside my window again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I called campus security. They arrived quickly, but whoever had been there was gone, leaving fresh footprints in the snow. Eventually, the disturbances stopped, and Dylan disappeared from my life. I never learned what happened to him, but the experience left a lasting impact. It made me more cautious, aware of my surroundings, and careful about who I trusted. I double-checked locks, avoided walking alone at night, and became more protective of my personal information. I'll never forget my very first job. As a high school senior eager to make some money over the summer, I jumped at the chance to work at a small, cozy movie theater near my neighborhood. The job seemed perfect, it was close to home, the pay was decent, and no prior experience was required. The idea of spending my days surrounded by the smell of popcorn and the buzz of movies felt exciting. I applied immediately and was hired soon after. The theater manager, Mr. Reynolds, had a stern and serious demeanor. His instructions were simple: clean the counters and seats, take out the trash, restock the concession stand, and assist my coworker with ticket sales. But there was one rule he emphasized more than anything else: don't stay past 2 a.m. Lock up and leave immediately. No exceptions. His tone was unsettling, but I didn't think much of it. I was too thrilled about landing my first job. The first few weeks were uneventful. My coworker, Alexa, was polite but kept to herself, and we worked efficiently during our shifts. The paychecks were better than I had expected, though I didn't question why. Over time, however, I began to notice oddities. Alexa often seemed tense, especially on weekend nights. She hurried to finish closing duties by 1:30 a.m. and urged me to do the same. One evening, I caught her having a hushed conversation with Mr. Reynolds. Their voices were low and strained. When I asked her about it later, she brushed me off with a strained smile. "Nothing. Just, make sure you lock up quickly, okay?" Her words left me uneasy. Everything changed on a quiet Friday night when Alexa left early, leaving me to close up on my own. I didn't mind, the theater was empty, and I figured I'd take my time cleaning. The silence felt strangely peaceful at first. But as I wiped down the concession counter, I caught a glimpse of something in the reflection of the glass. At first, I thought it was a smudge, but then the shape shifted. It was faint, but I could see it, a figure standing in the shadows at the far end of the lobby. My chest tightened, and I whipped around, but the lobby was empty. "Calm down," I told myself. "You're just tired." But the uneasy feeling lingered. Determined to finish quickly, I completed my tasks, locked the theater, and headed to the dumpster to throw out the trash. The parking lot was unnervingly still, the streetlights flickering faintly. As I neared the dumpster, I heard soft footsteps behind me. I froze, straining to listen, but the sound stopped. My pulse quickened as I spun around. Nothing. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a shadow slipping around the side of the building. Fear surged through me, and I dropped the trash bag, sprinting back into the theater and locking the door behind me. I glanced through the glass doors and froze. The figure was there, standing just outside, face obscured by a mask, watching me. The next day, I reported the incident to Mr. Reynolds. To my surprise, he didn't seem shocked. "You probably imagined it," he said dismissively. "I didn't," I insisted. "There was someone outside. They were wearing a mask." His jaw tightened, but all he said was, "Focus on your job. Lock up on time." Frustrated, I turned to Alexa, hoping for answers. She hesitated before finally confiding in me. "This place, it's strange. I've seen things too," she admitted quietly. "Shadows, whispers, footsteps. It's why I leave early." My stomach nodded. "Why doesn't anyone say anything? Why are we still working here?" She shook her head. "Mr. Reynolds won't talk about it, but there are stories. Rumors about a former employee. They say he became obsessed with the late-night screenings, stayed after hours, and attacked someone during his shift. He wore a mask to hide his identity. People say his spirit never left." That Saturday, Alexa called in sick, leaving me alone again. Determined to finish early, I worked quickly, but the theater felt different that night. The air seemed heavy, charged with an unsettling energy. Every sound, the hum of the projector, the creak of the floor, put me on edge. As I cleaned the last theater room, the lights flickered and went out. The emergency lights didn't come on, plunging me into darkness. Then I heard it, slow, deliberate footsteps behind me. "Alexa?" I called, my voice trembling. No answer. Heart racing, I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, sweeping it across the empty rows of seats. The beam caught something in the back, a figure, standing just beyond the light. Its head tilted unnaturally, and it was wearing a mask. Panic overtook me. I dropped my phone and ran. In the lobby, I locked the doors behind me, but when I turned to look, the figure was outside again, standing motionless under the flickering streetlights. Suddenly, light from Theater 1 spilled into the lobby. The projector had turned on by itself, displaying static that morphed into distorted footage of the theater. On the screen, I saw myself cleaning earlier that night. The footage shifted again, to the masked figure standing just behind me, close enough to touch. A whisper came from behind me, "You're late." I screamed and bolted for the emergency exit. The door wouldn't budge. The whisper came again, louder and closer, "Time's up." Desperate, I slammed my shoulder against the door until it gave way, and I stumbled outside, running into the night without looking back. The next morning, I quit without explanation. Mr. Reynolds tried calling me, but I ignored him. Alexa texted, asking what had happened, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. Over time, I heard rumors of strange accidents and employees who vanished during their shifts. To this day, I don't know what haunted that theater, the ghost of the masked man or something far worse. All I know is that I'll never step foot there again. I never imagined my dog Rocky would one day save my life. Rocky, a German shepherd with warm brown fur, sharp black markings, and a fluffy tail, has always been loyal and protective. To me, though, he was simply a loving companion, a sweet dog who loved belly rubs and curling up by my side. That belief changed completely one cold November night. I live in a small, cozy house on the edge of the woods, a peaceful retreat far from the noise of the city. Most evenings, Rocky and I settle on the couch, me with a book or a TV show, and him stretched out near my feet. The solitude is something I cherish, though sometimes the stillness can feel unnerving. That particular night, the wind howled through the trees, making the house creak more than usual. Wrapped in a blanket with a cup of tea, I tried to ignore the eerie sounds outside. Rocky lay near the front door, his head resting on his paws, looking half asleep. As I got up to turn off the lights and head to bed, he suddenly perked up. His ears stood at attention, and his eyes locked on the door with startling intensity. "What is it, boy?" I asked, expecting nothing more than a restless animal outside. But Rocky didn't move. His body was tense, his gaze fixed, and a low growl rumbled in his throat, vibrating through the quiet room. A chill ran down my spine as I tried to listen for whatever he was sensing. All I could hear was the wind, but Rocky's behavior was too unusual to ignore. I walked to the window and peeked outside. The yard was empty, just shadows of swaying trees under the moonlight. I sighed in relief and turned back to reassure him. "See? Nothing out th." Before I could finish, Rocky leaped to his feet, barking furiously. He charged to the door, his nails scraping the floor as he skidded to a stop. My heart pounded as I grabbed my phone. Then I heard it, a faint, crunching sound, like footsteps on the gravel outside. It was so quiet I almost convinced myself I was imagining things, but Rocky's reaction told me otherwise. His barking grew louder, and he pressed his nose against the door, growling deeply. Someone was out there. My hands trembled as I dialed 911. The dispatcher assured me help was on the way and told me to stay calm and keep the line open. That was easier said than done. I backed away from the door, clutching the phone tightly, while Rocky remained planted in place, every muscle taut. Suddenly, a loud bang shook the door, no polite knock, but a forceful crash, as if someone was trying to break in. "Rocky, get back!" I shouted, panic making my voice crack. His barking turned wild, his body slamming against the door to push back whoever was on the other side. Splinters flew as the wood began to give way. My mind raced, and I grabbed the fireplace poker, clutching it like a lifeline. The door burst open with a deafening crash, pieces of wood scattering across the floor. A man stepped inside, his face obscured by a dark mask. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and his very presence sent a wave of fear crashing over me. But Rocky didn't hesitate. With a fierce snarl, he launched himself at the intruder, a blur of fur and teeth. The man stumbled back, clearly unprepared for the force of an enraged German shepherd. Rocky latched onto the man's arm, growling and shaking his head violently. The man screamed in pain, a guttural sound that froze me in place for a moment. But then I found my voice. "Get out!" I yelled, my voice shaky but loud. The man struggled, trying to shake Rocky off, but Rocky held on, his teeth sinking deeper. Blood stained the man's sleeve, and even through the mask, I could see the panic in his eyes. Finally, the intruder managed to shove Rocky away and bolted out the door, clutching his arm as he disappeared into the darkness. Rocky didn't stop there. He chased the man to the edge of the yard, barking fiercely into the night. When the silence finally returned, Rocky trotted back to me, his tail wagging as though it had all been just another game. I dropped to my knees, wrapping my arms around him as tears streamed down my face. "Good boy," I whispered over and over. "You're such a good boy." The police arrived soon after. They examined the shattered door and took my statement. One officer knelt down to pet Rocky, calling him a hero. They suspected the intruder had been watching the house for some time, waiting for an opportunity to break in. The thought made my skin crawl, but I couldn't dwell on it, not when Rocky had been there to protect me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house made me jump, and the image of the intruder stayed vivid in my mind. But as I looked over at Rocky, lying by the fireplace and watching me with his ever-alert eyes, I felt a sense of safety. He wasn't just my dog, he was my guardian. Rocky saved my life that night, and I'll never forget it. This story unfolded during last year's Christmas break. I have a wonderful family, a loving husband and 4 incredible children, and we all live in London. That year, we decided to celebrate Christmas somewhere new, far from the usual city bustle. With my siblings and parents joining us, Greenland seemed like the perfect choice. Its serene, snowy landscapes promised a peaceful holiday. But none of us could have anticipated the nightmare that awaited us. We flew out late on December 23rd. The flight was uneventful but long, and we finally arrived in Greenland around 11 p.m., exhausted. After picking up a rental car, we drove to a charming little chalet nestled among snowy hills, just 10 minutes from the airport. The house was quaint and inviting, and as soon as my head hit the pillow, I drifted into a deep sleep. The next day felt like a dream come true. We explored the breathtaking surroundings, admiring the untouched beauty of the tundra, and spent quality time together. By nightfall, I was convinced this would be one of our most treasured holidays. But that sense of joy didn't last long. The kids were thrilled as they unwrapped their presents, and we all enjoyed a hearty breakfast together. By noon, we were ready for an adventure, so we packed up the car and drove to a nearby mountain trail for a hike. The landscape was magical, with snow-draped trees and sparkling frost everywhere we looked. About 15 minutes into the hike, we stopped to take photos, everyone smiling and full of holiday cheer. That's when everything changed. Out of nowhere, 3 men appeared, their faces hidden behind black ski masks. My stomach dropped as I realized what was happening. One man held a knife, and the other 2 brandished pistols. "Don't scream. Don't run," the tallest of the 3 said, his voice cold and emotionless. The children clung to my husband and me, their faces pale with fear. My heart raced as the horrifying reality sank in. We were alone, miles from any help, and completely at their mercy. "Give us everything you've got," one of them barked, waving his pistol threateningly. Trembling, we scrambled to obey, handing over phones, wallets, and watches. The men moved methodically, stuffing our belongings into a backpack. My husband tried to keep the kids calm, murmuring reassurances, though I could see the helpless rage in his eyes. The shortest man, jittery and impatient, rummaged through our bags. "This is it. This is all you have," he snapped. "Please," I stammered, my voice shaky. "We don't have anything else. Just take what you want and leave us alone." For a moment, it seemed like they might go. But then, without warning, the shorter man grabbed my youngest son, Liam, who was only 6 years old. "No, let him go!" I screamed, rushing forward. The tall man shoved me back hard, his knife glinting in the sunlight. "We need leverage," the shorter man muttered. "In case they call the cops." My husband stepped forward, his voice trembling with anger. "Take me instead. Leave him alone." "Stay back, or he's done," the man with the gun growled, aiming it directly at my husband. Time seemed to stop. Liam's cries echoed in the cold air as the men dragged him into the woods. I tried to run after them, but my siblings held me back, their own terror etched across their faces. We stood frozen in horror as the masked men disappeared into the trees, taking Liam with them. We sprinted back to the car, hearts pounding with dread. My husband drove straight to the nearest police station, where we filed a frantic report, struggling through tears and shattered voices. The officers assured us they would do everything they could to find Liam, but their somber expressions betrayed their doubt. Out here in the remote wilderness, the odds were slim. That night, none of us could sleep. Every sound outside the chalet felt menacing, and my mind was consumed by guilt and fear. I couldn't stop blaming myself for what had happened. The next morning, we ended our trip early and flew back to London. Christmas had passed, but our hearts were heavy with grief. The days that followed blurred into an endless cycle of waiting and despair. We worked closely with the authorities, clinging to any sliver of hope, but leads were scarce. The men had vanished without a trace, leaving no clue as to where they had taken Liam or why. Weeks turned into months, and as the trail grew cold, hope began to fade. Each phone call from the police filled me with equal parts anticipation and dread, but the answers never came. I took a leave of absence from work, unable to focus on anything but the aching void in my heart. My siblings and parents tried to support us, offering comfort and love, but nothing could ease the pain. Our once happy home became a place of quiet sorrow. My other children grew withdrawn, their laughter replaced by hushed whispers. My husband and I struggled to hold each other up, each of us overwhelmed by guilt and grief. To this day, Liam's fate remains a mystery. Back in 2017, my friend Eric and I took a weekend trip to Texas, just looking for something fun to do. Eric, always the thrill seeker, suggested we check out an abandoned mental hospital on the edge of town. "People say it's haunted," he said with a grin. I wasn't keen on the idea, but I didn't want him calling me a coward. Besides, it was daylight, what could possibly happen? The hospital looked straight out of a horror film, broken windows, graffiti-covered walls, and a crooked front door creaking in the breeze. "Looks like it'll collapse on us," I joked, trying to mask my unease. Eric laughed and headed inside, and I reluctantly followed. The air was stale and heavy with the smell of mold. Sunlight filtered through broken windows but did little to make the place feel less unsettling. Long, dark hallways stretched ahead, with doors hanging slightly open, like they were daring us to enter. Faded posters and strange graffiti covered the walls. For a while, all we found were empty rooms and broken furniture. Eric made light of it, tapping walls and cracking jokes. Then we came across a steel door near the end of a hallway. It was slightly ajar, and Eric pushed it open with a screech of the hinges. Inside, the room was almost empty, just a few old chairs, a table, and strange symbols painted on the walls. The air here was noticeably colder. That's when we heard it, faint children's laughter. It echoed off the walls, growing louder until it seemed to surround us. Eric froze, his usual confidence wavering. "Kids," he said, trying to sound casual, probably messing with us. Then came the soft thud of something hitting the wall, a small rock. And another. Annoyed, Eric muttered, "Let's teach them a lesson," and headed down the hallway toward the front door. I followed him outside, but the yard was empty. No kids, no movement, just silence and the wind stirring the grass. "They couldn't have run off that fast," Eric said, frowning. We called out, but no one answered. Then, faintly, the laughter started again. This time, it was coming from inside the hospital. Eric and I exchanged uneasy glances. "That's not funny anymore," he muttered, his confidence fading. My chest tightened as we stepped back inside, moving slower now. The building felt oppressively quiet, as if it were holding its breath. When we returned to the room, the door was wide open, though we'd left it barely ajar. Stranger still, the chairs and table were gone. Eric cursed under his breath. "Let's just get out of here," he said. For once, I didn't argue. We walked quickly back down the hallway, not stopping until we were outside again. Neither of us spoke much on the way to the car. Eric kept glancing over his shoulder, and I felt the same creeping sense that we were being watched. We didn't talk about it after that day, and I haven't set foot in another abandoned building since. When I was 8 years old, the world felt small but endlessly magical. Even the simplest things seemed to hold wonder, the crunch of fresh snow beneath my boots, or the way snowflakes shimmered under the streetlights at night. I saw beauty in every detail, and winter nights always felt cozy and safe. But one snowy evening, something happened that shattered that sense of security, something I still can't explain. It was a particularly cold night, and a thick blanket of snow had transformed the world outside my window. My dad had just tucked me into bed, pulling the covers snug around me like he always did. He patted my head, told me to sleep tight, and turned off the light. I smiled at him and pretended to close my eyes, but I wasn't sleepy. My mind was filled with thoughts of the snow falling softly outside. Through the thin curtains over my window, I could see the snowflakes illuminated in the glow of the streetlights. They looked like tiny stars, twinkling as they floated down to the ground. When I heard my dad's footsteps retreat down the hallway and the creak of his bedroom door closing, I pushed back my blanket and tiptoed to the window. Pulling aside the curtain, I pressed my face against the cold glass. Outside, the world looked pristine and untouched, like a scene from a postcard. The yard was covered in fresh snow, smooth and perfect except for a small trail of footprints leading toward the woods. I wondered what had left them, a rabbit, maybe. Or a fox. The thought made me smile. The quiet of the snow was comforting but also strange, like the world outside my house was completely separate from the one I knew. I stood there for what felt like forever, watching the snow drift gently down. Everything felt peaceful, until I heard it. A loud bang echoed from my bedroom door. The sound was sharp and sudden, like someone had struck it with their fist. I gasped and spun around, my heart racing. My mind scrambled for an explanation. Maybe the heater had made a pipe knock, or the door had shifted in its frame. But when I looked at the door, I froze. In the doorway stood a figure, small and dark. At first, I thought it might be a person, but something was wrong. Its form was completely black, not like a shadow but as if it had absorbed every bit of light in the room. The hallway light behind it cast its shape into sharp relief, but there were no features, no face, no eyes, no nose. Just a solid, motionless silhouette. I stared at it, my mind racing with questions that made no sense. Was this some kind of trick? A prank by my parents? But the figure was too short to be my dad, and my mom wouldn't stand silently in the doorway like that. I felt a chill creep over me that had nothing to do with the snow outside. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move. It didn't answer. It just stood there, as though it was waiting for something. I wanted to scream, to call for my parents, but my throat felt tight, like my body had decided staying silent was the safest thing to do. After a moment, though it felt like an eternity, I turned back to the window. I don't know why. Maybe I thought if I ignored it, it would go away. Or maybe I just couldn't bear to keep looking at it. I tried to focus on the snow again, but the magic was gone. The yard that had seemed so peaceful a moment ago now felt cold and empty, like the entire world had been wiped clean. I stood there, staring out the window, afraid to turn around. Time felt strange, stretching and twisting. It might have been a few minutes or just seconds before I finally worked up the courage to glance back at the door. The figure was gone. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I bolted from my bed, dove under the covers, and pulled them over my head. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I stayed like that for the rest of the night, too terrified to move. The next morning, I told my parents what had happened. They looked at me with a mix of concern and amusement. "It was probably just a dream," my mom said, patting my hand. "Or maybe you saw your shadow," my dad offered. The hallway light could have made it look strange. I could tell they didn't believe me, but I knew the truth. It wasn't a dream, and it wasn't my shadow. I had been wide awake, and whatever I saw had been real. I never saw the figure again, but its presence still haunts me. On snowy winter nights, when the world feels quiet and still, I think about that shadowy figure in my doorway. What was it? Why was it there? And why didn't it do anything? I don't think I'll ever know the answers, but I do know one thing: I'll never look out my window at night again.